When you think about geography, you might think about something like this, your grade 9 geography textbook. Hi, my name is Renee, and today I'll be talking about GIS and analysis of local economies. First, I'll give a brief overview of what GIS is. Then, I'll be talking briefly about cluster economics. And lastly, I'll be talking about a case study of research I did about Toronto's green economy. So, what is GIS? You may think of a map as something you just use to get from point A to point B, but maps can really tell us so much more. GIS is used to capture and model spatial data. For researchers, GIS is a powerful tool for visualizing data that might not be very well suited for a bar chart or a pie chart. GIS has a number of applications, including floodplain mapping, epidemiology, and of course, analyzing local economies. There are three main platforms that are commonly used for GIS analysis. The first and most commonly used is ArcGIS, which is produced by ESRI. ArcGIS is available for desktop and also the web. As well, QGIS is an open source software similar to ArcGIS that is free and accessible to anyone. Lastly, you can even use Google Earth to conduct simple GIS analysis. Roger Tomlinson is considered the father of GIS, but before his computer models became popularized, early researchers and scientists were already using a rudimentary form of GIS. Perhaps the most famous example of early GIS is the case of the Broad Street Pump. In 1854, epidemiologist and Dr. John Snow set out to test his hypothesis that the cholera outbreak in London was being caused not by miasma, but by contaminated water. In John Snow's time, it was commonly believed that sickness and disease were caused by miasma, which is a word for foul smells in the air. However, John Snow used this early form of GIS to map cases of cholera against locations of water pumps. He found that many of the cases centered around the Broad Street Pump, thus proving his hypothesis that cholera was caused not by miasma, but by contaminated water. Today, we have used GIS for similar purposes. The map on the right shows the concentration of COVID-19 cases in different neighborhoods in Toronto. This data has been used by the government to reprioritize the distribution of vaccines to make sure that those living in the hardest hit communities have access to vaccines first. Epidemiology is one critical application of GIS, but it has so much more. In particular, we'll be discussing GIS and the analysis of local economies. Before I talk about my case study, let's get some background on cluster economics. Cluster theory is in essence an economic theory that tells us about where specific areas of economic activity are concentrated. It was first described in 1890 by Alfred Marshall and later expanded upon by Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School in the 1990s. There are four types of clusters. First, geographic clusters. A geographic cluster is an area where a number of resources and businesses have concentrated such that it gives them an economic edge over other areas. An example of this is the California wine cluster. A sectoral cluster is a cluster of businesses operating within the same economic sector. So think Silicon Valley. A horizontal cluster is a cluster of businesses that compete for the same market. So think about bike shops. If you have a bunch of different bike shops in a neighborhood, they're all competing for the same customers to come buy bikes. Conversely, a vertical cluster is a coalition or partnership between businesses in the same sector but at different levels of the supply chain. So again, using the cycling industry as an example, we can think of bike shops as the retailers who are selling to the end users, and then above them in the supply chain are parts and bicycle suppliers, and then above that are manufacturers. For our purposes, we'll mostly be talking about geographic clusters. In 2019, I conducted research for the City of Toronto in the Department of Economic Development. Specifically, I conducted research on Toronto's green economy. This diagram illustrates the various sectors in Toronto's green economy, including the bioeconomy, clean energy, green buildings, resource management, and sustainable transportation. Within these subsectors, you can see that there are various clusters. Of these many clusters, I researched the water cluster in depth. The water cluster is defined as companies that build, repair, and maintain water infrastructure. So think sewers, water mains, and all of the major water infrastructure that keeps our city running. The water cluster is part of the resource management subsector. This map of companies in the water cluster tells us that companies in this cluster are strongly concentrated in the downtown core as well as somewhat in Etobicoke and North York. To create this map, I used QGIS and data from the 2017 Toronto Employment Survey. As you can see, GIS helps us to effectively visualize what areas of the city have the most and least economic activity within this cluster. These visualizations are very useful for economic development as they tell us about where to direct resources and investment and give us options for how we can grow clusters in different areas of the city. As I said before, GIS has many applications, not only analysis of local economies and epidemiology, but other important things like floodplain mapping that is critical for both conservation and land development. While traditional data visualizations are incredibly important and provide us with great insights, when using data that is connected to a spatial location, it can often be advantageous to use GIS to model your data as opposed to a bar chart or a pie chart. Thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope that the next time you're looking at spatial data, you'll consider using a map.